Hey everyone, ready to dive into some really interesting migraine research. We've got 3 articles here, 2 new studies from Japan and Iran, plus a big review on craniofacial autonomic dysfunction.
Lot to unpack there.
There is.
Yeah.
But you know what really caught our eye? This whole thing about cranial autonomic symptoms, or CAS.
CAS.
And how surprisingly common they are in migraine.
Way more than people realize, yeah.
Exactly. But before we get too far, can you give us a quick CAS 101?
Sure.
What are we actually talking about here?
So think about it this way. CAS, it's basically a bunch of symptoms all happening in your head and face.
Okay.
And they're all tied to your autonomic nervous system, the system that controls all the stuff your body does automatically, right?
Yeah.
Like, you don't have to think about your heart beating. It just does. So with CAS, we're talking about things like a runny nose, watery eyes, that kind of thing.
Yeah, stuff you might not even think to connect with your migraine at first.
Exactly.
And what's wild is just how many people are dealing with this alongside their migraine.
It is.
One of the Japanese studies found over 42% of their migraine patients had CAS. That's almost half.
Yeah, it's huge.
And it's not just in that study either. The Iranian research found it was even higher, almost 61%.
Wow.
I mean, those numbers can vary a bit depending on who they're studying and how.
Yeah.
But still,
A lot of people.
it really makes you wonder how many people are out there with migraine who aren't getting the help they need, because this whole CAS thing is going unnoticed, right?
Absolutely.
There's a whole other layer to migraine.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why it's so important to understand what's actually causing it. And one of the biggest things that keeps coming up is this concept called central sensitization.
Okay, so, we've talked about migraine before on the show, but CAS adds this whole other level.
It does.
So break this down for me. What does central sensitization actually mean for someone who gets migraines?
You ever get a really bad sunburn where even the lightest touch hurts like crazy?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So imagine that kind of sensitivity, but instead of just being on your skin, it's happening all the time, all over your body.
Ouch.
Yeah, not fun. That's kind of what central sensitization is like. Your nervous system is basically stuck in overdrive.
So like the volume knob for pain is permanently turned up way too high.
Exactly. And with CAS, what we see is that this heightened sensitivity is often a big part of what's going on.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So how does this actually relate back to migraine, though?
Well, this is where the research gets really interesting. So remember how I mentioned central sensitization, meaning your nervous system is super sensitive? Well, the Japanese study actually found a strong link between CAS and something called cutaneous allodynia.
Cutaneous what now?
Basically, it's just a fancy way of saying you're extra sensitive to touch, which is a big sign of central sensitization.
Okay, so if they're finding that connection between CAS and this cutaneous allodynia, that's a pretty big deal then.
It is, yeah, because it really points to central sensitization being a major player in how CAS develops in migraine.
Makes sense.
And it gets even more interesting when you consider the trigeminal nerve, which, as you know, is very involved in migraine.
Trigeminal nerve, that's the one that controls all the sensations in your face.
Exactly.
Okay.
And there's this thing called the trigeminal autonomic reflex, which the review article talks about.
Okay.
Basically, it's like this loop where the trigeminal nerve gets stuck on overdrive.
Okay.
And that can trigger all those uncomfortable CAS symptoms.
So we're seeing these potential connections now between central sensitization, this trigeminal nerve going haywire, and then symptoms like a runny nose or watery eyes.
Exactly.
It's like we're starting to get a glimpse into what's actually happening in the body.
Yeah, for sure. And it really highlights just how complex migraine is and how much we're still learning about how it affects people in different ways.
And speaking of different ways migraine affects people, one thing that really jumped out, especially with these studies coming from Japan and Iran, was that link between CAS and osmophobia.
Osmophobia, right?
Yeah.
For anyone listening who's not familiar, it basically means being super sensitive to smells.
Yeah, like your sense of smell is just in overdrive.
Exactly.
And the Japanese study, they found a pretty strong connection between that and CAS, especially in their Asian migraine patients.
It's interesting, isn't it?
It is, because we always hear about things like bright lights and loud noises being migraine triggers.
Right.
But smell just adds this whole other sensory dimension.
It does.
It really makes you wonder, like, if someone's dealing with CAS on top of their migraine, could certain smells actually be part of what's setting it off?
It's definitely possible. Yeah.
Like maybe a smell that wouldn't bother most people could be a huge trigger for someone with CAS.
Exactly, and it's something we definitely need more research on.
Right.
Because there's not a ton of data out there specifically about smell sensitivity and migraine.
Right.
Like, this study mentioned a couple of other studies that suggested osmophobia might be more common in Japanese and Taiwanese migraine patients than in Western populations.
Oh, wow, really? See, that's what I find so fascinating. What could explain that kind of difference? Could it be genetic, cultural, some combination of both?
It's a great question.
Because if migraine shows up differently in different groups of people,
Yeah.
what does that mean for how we diagnose it, how we treat it? Those are things we need to be thinking about.
Absolutely. It all comes back to personalized medicine, right? The more we know about these little differences, the better we can tailor treatment plans to each person.
Exactly. And on that note, there's one more thing I want to make sure we hit that finding from the Iranian study about blurred vision as a potential CAS symptom.
Oh, right.
Because we usually think of blurred vision with aura, right?
Yeah,
But this suggests it might be a whole different thing.
it could be. So blurred vision, it's not typically considered a core CAS symptom, but this Iranian study, they found a significant link between blurred vision and CAS in migraineurs.
So interesting.
Yeah, and it really makes you think, could this be another way that the autonomic nervous system is messing with things during a migraine attack?
Right. It's like we're starting to connect the dots between all these seemingly separate migraine symptoms.
Yeah.
And realizing there's probably way more going on behind the scenes than we thought.
I think so, yeah. It's why this area of research is so exciting. It's like we have to challenge our assumptions and look at migraine in a whole new light.
Totally. So if blurred vision in migraine could be tied to this autonomic dysfunction we've been talking about,
Right.
does that change how we think about treating it? Are we even targeting the right things?
Right.
That's the million-dollar question, right? Now, the studies we have here, they didn't specifically focus on CAS treatments.
Right.
But the review article, it did mention that triptans and onabotulinum toxin A, which are both pretty commonly used for migraine management,
Okay.
they might actually be more effective in people with CAS.
Interesting. So that's potentially good news.
Yeah.
But we really need more research that's focused specifically on this, right? We do. We need to know for sure if directly addressing CAS can actually lead to better outcomes for people with migraine.
It really feels like we're putting together a puzzle here with CAS and migraine. You know, like we've got the edges figured out. We're starting to see the bigger picture.
Yeah.
But there are still these gaps.
There are a lot of gaps.
And it's like that's what makes this whole area of research so exciting.
Absolutely, because what we've talked about today, it's really just scratching the surface, you know?
Right.
And the fact that it raises more questions than answers, I think that's a good thing.
Oh, for sure.
It means we're on to something big.
Yeah.
Like, we could be on the verge of some major breakthroughs in how we think about and treat migraine.
So, as someone who's like really in the weeds with all this,
Yeah.
what are the big unanswered questions about CAS that you're most curious about? What's keeping you up at night?
That's a good question. I think for me, it really comes down to treatment, you know?
Okay.
Like, can we use what we're learning about CAS to actually develop better treatments for migraine? Treatments that are more effective, more targeted. Like, imagine if we could identify specific things in the body that tell us someone is more likely to have CAS,
Okay.
or that a particular treatment would work really well for them.
Wow. Yeah. That would be huge.
It would be groundbreaking, because then we're not just managing symptoms, we're actually getting at the root cause.
Right. Like really making a difference.
Exactly. And I think that's what we're all striving for, right? To help people with migraine find real, lasting relief.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, I want to say a huge thank you for taking this deep dive with us into CAS and migraine.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk about this stuff.
And to everyone listening, we hope this episode has given you a better understanding of just how complex migraine really is and how these cranial autonomic symptoms, they can play a big role.
They really can.
So if you're dealing with migraine, don't be afraid to talk to your doctor about CAS, about all your symptoms.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, right?
It is. And in the meantime, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and we'll catch you next time for another deep dive.